Okay, so we've talked about some of the reaction and progress we see with the 1920s, and what did this progress lead to cultural changes. Now, these new freedoms that we see associated with the automobile, with some of this technology, these new freedoms afforded by technological change changed the lives of many. One group that enjoyed this freedom was the new teenager. Child labor laws, compulsory education, and people getting married later in life, they no longer got married at 16 or 17, they gave rise to a new demographic, the teenager, and thus a new market. Now, the teenager would really explode as a market in the 50s, but we see the beginning of this in the 1920s, because again, before this, you're 16 or 17, you're married, you're working, you're not going to school. Things changed in the 1920s, again, as a result of these key things, because of child labor changing, because now kids are forced to go to school. And then they're getting married later in life. So the automobile would play a role in the freedom of the teenager. For example, dating methods had changed. Prior, courting consisted of a night at a parent's house, meeting the girlfriend's parents, spending time with them, getting to know them with no real privacy. Maybe after a few of these types of dates, they could go unchaperoned. Maybe there'd be a peck on the cheek on the porch at night. But with the automobile, this changed. The boy could pick the girl up in the car. They could go somewhere else, a movie, out to eat, just to drive, to make out point. They now had privacy, and what happens when teens have privacy? They have sex. A sexual revolution begins, somewhat tame compared to what we see in the 1960s, quite tame compared to what we see in the 1960s, and this would more greatly impact young professional women. But the sexual revolution begins, and sex before marriage begins to increase. Transportation changes also led to a new feeling of community among teenagers at the consolidated high schools. No more were folks restricted to one-room schoolhouses in suburban or rural areas. They now could drive or take a bus to one centrally located school. Teens began to form their own communities, their own groups. They began to develop their own cultural patterns with this togetherness. Now, another group that experienced more freedom, though not necessarily because of the automobile, was the flapper. In the 1920s, we see the rise of the independent woman. Suffrage provided women political equality, and they would take advantage of this by organizing in new ways. For example, we see the League of Women Voters. We've also discussed the fact that women were very much at the fore of the progressive movement. So women are more out in public now. They're in society. They are leading change. They're no longer simply restricted to the household. In many ways, they are restricted, but for many, there is a new opportunity, and women are going to school. So again, we see this active social change from women. With suffrage, they get the political equality. We see the rise of birth control, led by Margaret Sanger, a noted eugenicist. If you're not familiar with eugenics, please look it up. But for young women, this decade was about independence and fun. Flappers were mostly northern, urban, single, young, middle-class women. Their general appearance, again, not all, but in general, they had short hair. This was in contrast to the traditional Victorian styles of long hair. They wore knee-high hemlines on dresses, which showed the ankle. This was revolutionary, believe it or not. They wore makeup. They wore high heels. They bound their chests. They worked as clerks, as phone operators, in department stores. Women were working more during this decade, especially young single women, and this expands their opportunity to explore more freedom. They enjoy nightlife. They engage in nightlife. They go to jazz clubs. They go to vaudeville shows. They go to the speakeasies. Women are going out and they are participating in activities previously viewed as forbidden. They're drinking alcohol. They're smoking cigarettes in public. And they're engaging in sexual experimentation. Now, flappers claimed their female Declaration of Independence. They turned political liberation into social liberation. They sought for the first time to please themselves rather than others. For example, fathers and husbands. And this would allow them to establish themselves without regard to being the other. Now, what is the other? Maybe you're familiar with this term, especially if you've studied feminism at all. The other is an idea that was coined, or the term that was coined by Simone de Beauvoir, I don't want to say a feminist. She was a leader of women's rights in the 20th century. De Beauvoir came up with this idea of the other, the concept that women are defined as their role in relation to others, rather than defined on their own merits. So women are not Women are not salespeople. They're not lawyers. They're not doctors. They're wives. They're daughters. They're sisters. If that makes sense. They're now, again, well, this is beginning to change, but up until now, and even much through the 20th century, women are defined as their status in accordance with men, or in relation to men, rather than on their own merits. So this is why the flappers are so revolutionary, because again, they are looking to please themselves, not their fathers, not their husbands, not their brothers. They're worried about themselves. So this really begins a change in how women are active in society, and really the way psychology changes, because now there is an appreciation of themselves. But again, flapperism for the most part is non-political. But again, the social change is very important, not just for what we see in the 1920s, but how it kind of lays the foundation for later decades. Now, African Americans also found new ways to experience and celebrate freedom, however limited these freedoms were. Now, we've talked after the Civil War, the South returned to white domination. We discussed limitation of political rights, of social rights, etc. Many African Americans would move to the North. We discussed immigrants living together in neighborhoods of ethnic concentrations of people. This happens with African Americans as well. Living together in the North, they find that they have shared experiences and interests. They also that they have shared culture and arts, and this leads to an explosion of cultural pride. One such area was Harlem. Now, African American consciousness in literature and music comes through as African Americans call for black voices to be heard and recognized, for an expansion of rights, and praise their own cultural traditions. We see individuals like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, Jan Toomer, Zora Neale Hurston, Paul Robeson. Jazz music becomes popular. It's focused on improvisation, syncopated rhythms, and this would be popular among many whites as well. The Cotton Club was one of these famous jazz clubs. It was here where Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Jelly Roll Morton, and Louis Armstrong would play and help lay the foundation for a truly American musical genre. The search for rights and dignity for African Americans did not stop at the end of Harlem or other similar areas, though. It is during the 1920s when W.E.B. Du Bois and the NAACP continued to grow and utilize their preferred method of initiating change, via the courts. Du Bois also would attend the Pan-African Congress in London, a meeting of black leaders from around the world in which common goals would be established. A Pan-African Association would establish its headquarters in Paris and demand racial equality, and that Africans rule Africa, not the empires that had carved it up already. These demands are sent to the Young League of Nations, which does nothing about them. We also see the rise of the Back to Africa movement led by Jamaican Marcus Garvey, considered the Negro Moses. Now, Garvey founded the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He criticized Du Bois for attempting to achieve equality through integration. He endorsed racial separatism. His Black Star Line was a shipping company that facilitated commerce within the African diaspora and would take African Americans back to Africa and their homeland, where they could take control of the continent. Now, Garvey's goals were really quite simple. He wanted to establish a black sovereign state in Africa and create an international black economy. He did not necessarily achieve these goals immediately, but he is important in African American history for many reasons. His belief in separatism placed blacks on the same level as whites, which helped remove the traditional sense of white superiority and black inferiority. He raised consciousness and awareness of African culture and helped to instill a new sense of black pride among many. For example, black is beautiful, and this would be an important part of black nationalism in the 1960s. Many in the 1960s would reference Garvey and his UNIA, but again, this is important not because maybe he didn't achieve all his goals immediately, but he laid this foundation. He opened people's eyes. Again, he creates a new sense of African American consciousness, and this would really climax in the 60s. We'll get to that in a few weeks. Now, we have Garvey, we have the Harlem Renaissance, we have these many changes, but unfortunately there continued to be mistreatment of African Americans as well. Lynchings continued through the decade, often initiated by a false claim of rape. Black Wall Street in Greenwood, Oklahoma provides a larger example of this mistreatment, including the wholesale destruction of a prosperous community. The oil booms of the early 20th century led to migration westward, including into the state of Oklahoma. African Americans also took advantage of this opportunity, establishing a strong, prosperous community in the suburb of Greenwood, just outside of Tulsa. The African American section of Greenwood included numerous successful businesses, banks, hotels, cafes, etc. This came to be known as the Black Wall Street. In May of 1921, a young white woman accused a black man of sexual assault. This led to a mass reaction. On May 31st, 1921, white mobs entered the black community in Greenwood, attacked individuals and businesses, and exacted their sense of revenge. In the end, 300 African Americans were killed, 40 square blocks of 1,265 homes, schools, and hospitals, and other businesses were looted and burned to the ground. 150 businesses were destroyed, and 9,000 were left homeless. And Black Wall Street was essentially destroyed. So this shows, again, there is still a significant sense of racial antipathy. We have this in Omaha in 1919 with the lynching of Will Brown. It is still very commonplace. The riots in Chicago in 1919 as well. It's still a very divided country, and it will remain that way. One could argue through today, but it will very much remain that way through the 50s and 60s, which mandates the need for the civil rights movement. We'll get to that down the road, but I'm just kind of pointing out here, again, that African Americans are still facing quite a bit of hardship in the United States, even though they have carved out their own communities and created their own ways of life and really strengthened themselves in many ways. They're still marginalized. So, well, that's the 1920s for this week. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next week.